So welcome, Joe Cavalco. It's great to be with you again.
Thank you for inviting me, Katina.
Well, you've been our guest on the Public Interest Technology Colloquium, run out of Arizona State University, or you've been the host of the Technology and Ethics Working Research Group seminar series at the Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics at Yale University, which I've been on before. For those who don't know me, my name is Katina Michael. I'm the founding editor-in-chief of the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society. And we've invited Joe Cavalco onto this special recording for TTS to celebrate a recent achievement. It gives me great pleasure to announce that the Global AI Ethics White Paper Prize, given by the Global AI Ethics Institute located in Paris, was awarded to a peer-reviewed paper in IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society, written by you, Joe Cavalco.
Thank you.
It was announced a few months ago now on LinkedIn. It came with a nice $1,000 gift, of which I think you're mightily deserved of. We congratulate you on this timely work, which was on the topic of generative AI, ingenuity, and the law. And you sort of seem to have this uncanny knack of uh, writing pieces that preempt what's coming. And I don't know how you do that, but do you think it has something to do with your background?
Yeah, most certainly. I'm not omniscient, I guess, but after the number of years, you could tell from the hair loss that I've spent, at in technology and some other adventures or ventures of vocations, actually, that I've had a chance to see perhaps things and how they might unfold. Not the least of which was my long career as a patent lawyer. And as a patent lawyer, you're basically immersed, in making attempts to convince examiners and others as to how something and why something is important. And in that respect, you have to look ahead to see why this is going to be important, not for today, but perhaps over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Well, Atso Momcilovic on LinkedIn from the Global Ethics AI Institute, he had this to say, that your article offers a wide-ranging and rigorous analysis of how generative AI intersects with creativity, governance, and legal ethics. He says, from regulating autonomous systems to redefining authorship, Joseph's work captures the urgency and nuance we need in AI policy discourse. And we were talking just before we started to record this session, the importance of experience. And just going on what you talked about, given this rich background in law, in engineering, in authorship yourself, writing fiction and non-fiction books, and also your foray into music. How have you felt generative AI has adapted or changed or solidified some of the things that you have experienced with in the world?
I guess over the last couple of years, when I was first acquainted with generative AI, I not only read what most of us are reading about others, what others say it does and can do and the like, but I actually engaged in generative AI for in a number of different projects or things that are sort of fundamental, to what I do every day. Not the least of which, for instance, is practicing law. And so what I, quickly learned was that some of the major law services that were offering research, LexisNexis being one of them, or Westlaw, they immediately began to incorporate Gen AI into their products, which basically allows lawyers like myself to use it in a way, instead of creating, let's say, an essay, creating a legal brief or creating a contract, for example. And so I began to use that particular product, in my everyday work, right? To ask questions about what is the law in some jurisdiction that I may not ever have practiced. And how would this play out if this is my scenario, for example? Now, that has an upside and a downside. The downside is that sometimes, as we've discussed, and many commentators have discussed, generative AI doesn't always tell you the truth. And of course, it's not a person, so it doesn't have any agency in that respect. But the software hallucinates in the sense that it may give you answers that are not correct. They're totally wrong. So I've begun to realize or appreciate at that point, okay, that even though I was using it in a particular way, I had to use it from the standpoint of the intelligent lawyer who's listening and reading something that they could, at least in the first instance, evaluate, okay, as whether or not credible or not. And don't stop there, because depending on what your reason for doing this in the first place was, it's may require you to go beyond generative AI and actually satisfy yourself that what it's saying or doing is true. I mean, if you're working on a case involving someone's freedom, for instance, you may not want to take generative AI, okay, at its word. You may want to prove to yourself, based on the evidence and other things, right, that the law that you're going to recite and recite to a judge, for instance, is credible. Now, let's take another extreme, or not extreme, but let's take another example. Another example is, as you mentioned before, I'm a musician of sorts. Okay, I'm not, acclaimed or anything like that, but it's been in my family. It's been a part of me ever since I was a kid, and to this day, I play the piano every day. And so I began to appreciate how generative AI, okay, may be helpful or useful to me anyway, in song creation. All right, and so I found some generative AI things where I could create lyrics, for instance, and it could turn around a melody, for example, with those lyrics. And then I could transcribe that melody and embellish on it or improvise on it or change it entirely. But it gave me ideas. In other words, it has the capacity to provide ideas beyond what I was, frankly, probably capable of doing in some respects. For example, some of the things that I was producing in terms of lyrics had an attachment or an appreciation, I guess, more in the realm of country music. I've never played country music. I play jazz, all right? But so for me, it was an eye opener. And then I began to use it for folk music. Well, I don't play folk music. And so the melodies were sort of haunting, and they gave me an opportunity again to listen to my own lyrics and whatnot as played over. Do I have to go beyond that? No, of course not. This is not like a case, okay, where someone's freedom is at stake. All right. This is a case of where I'm in the creative mode. Now, we can now take this, okay, and let's bring it into something that is probably more likely to involve any one of us looking at this video at this point. And that's the construction or the composition, okay, of an essay, for instance. Right? I teach law, science, and technology, and every semester, what I ask is my students write anywhere from about a 10 to 15 page paper, okay, on law and technology. All right. I'm worried, okay, not worried, but I'd be concerned, okay, if I detected the fact that my students were using generative AI in the first instance. Because if you depend, as I did, let's say for my music, to get a handle on country music or folk music, that they were doing the same thing in order to get a handle on the particular technology that they were writing about or the law that they were writing about, I'd be concerned, because that's not really what I had intended by asking them to write the essay. What I intended by having them write the essay is that they're going to learn something about technology, and then they're going to learn something about the law, and they're going to put the two together to sort of have some idea as to how the law and technology sort of intertwine. That takes critical reading, takes critical thinking, takes critical writing. Okay, they've got to use their brain in the first instance in order to form concepts and the like. And so I'm afraid that if they began that way by just using it as I was using it to learn or to hear different forms of country music, I wouldn't be reaching my objective. So I think there's this there are these instances where generative AI may well be very interesting from an individual point of view in terms of using it for creative purposes. And then there may be instances when you've got to be really careful about how you're using it. And then there's those instances where you would be defeating the very reason, okay, why you're being tasked to do something, right? And in my case, what I described was my students writing essays. Now, those are all instances that I engaged in. I put myself into those things. To come back to what I said earlier, in 23, 24, I began to utilize as many of these different kinds of generative AI products as I could in order to sort of get a sense of where it was taking me and what it was doing to my own project, to my own where I wanted to be. What we haven't talked about, and maybe we can talk about it later, is that I'm thinking about these things, on a level which engages individuals like myself, perhaps as a teacher or as a musician or as a lawyer. But there's a whole different side of this that later on we can talk about. There's an economic side. For instance, how will generative AI at some point begin to displace workers? There's an economic side to all of this outside of my own cocoon, right? That involves a world of commerce and things that are maybe much more important than my learning country music.
Fascinating. I do remember the first time, probably a few months after GPT came out, I was sitting at the University of Wollongong in the law building. There's a beautiful cafeteria downstairs, and beside me were a bunch of students, probably about a dozen or so, talking about an assessment that was imminently due in a few minutes' time. And of course, I was incognito. I think I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt and a cap, and it's the first time I heard students conversing about GPT, and I was trying to think about what were they referring to? What in what context was this version question about? And it ended up being about whether they were using ChatGPT 3 or 3.5. And it dawned on me very quickly that initially they would think it was kind of like gold, given they could prescribe and prompt, certain things to happen.
Sure.
But their answers would probably look somewhat similar to a marker, and they weren't astute of that. When we remember the introduction of Google search, for instance, many of us were using different search engines because they all had different strengths back in, 94, 95 when we had the
Right.
WYSIWYG search engines come out. But, Alta Vista was probably the best one at the time, even Lycos from memory. And the others
Mm-hmm.
were sort of okay, but not fantastic. And then Google search comes through and just blows everything out of the water. But I do remember us not questioning at the time whether someone had used Google search. Much rather, we were asking the question as lecturers and employees in companies whether people had copied from the internet, which was a completely different scenario to today. But we do remember the edge Google search even gave us on our corporate intranet. All of a sudden, all of these documents that were available in the corporate intranet were searchable because of this wonderful search engine. And so my concern, however, is much like yours. I mean, as an editor-in-chief of 16 years in many different journals, if not more time, you can detect when something has been written by uh, a GPT, even without putting it through an analyzer. And today there are humanizing GPTs that can, make GPT outputs look more human and go undetected. So we're sort of fighting a losing battle there, even when we asked for people to write reflections. But I do think students, having marked some assignments in more undergraduate than postgraduate, are relying completely on GPT without trying to apply critical thinking. But I don't think it's as high a number as many people think. But we do have statistics saying at least 85% of student groups are using GPT for support in some augmented way for their assignments. But I think if they're not using it, I do worry about those 15% that haven't exposed themselves to GPT because they have to. and they have to understand how large language models work. But on the other side, I do believe there are many people that are just submitting at the last minute and not critically thinking about their work. Interesting, you also mentioned music and the creation of different genres that you've dabbled in, and it's encouraged you to go down avenues you've probably never thought about or hoped to, and just seen what that does to the lyrics and seen what that does to many things. There is a professor in the UK at Newcastle University, Savas Papagiannidis, who just changed or turned his theory book series, basically a bunch of highly peer-reviewed theory articles and chapters into music. And I listened to those a few days ago and thought, wow, it does bring out the essence of the theory. Perhaps is not something that I can use to apply in context, but I do remember after listening to the words of the music and the different melodies, exactly how the theory might fit in context. And it gave me a different way of understanding the theory. I've read the articles, but now I have this additional momentum and awareness of the kinds of sort of ways that the theory might be utilized and be understood. So it's very different to actually reading an article is to listen to a theory rather than reading how the theory works and is applied. But also then you dabbled onto this notion of um, law, searching databases, and I'm all for large language models that use peer-reviewed literature, such as LexisNexis or medical, diagnostic journals that help us identify a diagnosis faster to use peer-reviewed data. And if the world was just made up, if GPT was just made up of large language models that were based on content that was peer-reviewed, I'd trust it so much more. And I think it was so much more useful, particularly if it was in a vertical sector. If I'm a technologist, or I'm a patent lawyer, or I'm an engineer and I want to know how something works, I'd love to be able to rely on peer-reviewed databases. But of course, they're all behind paywalls. And you mentioned economics, but how's this for something? The UAE wants to come out and generate and create its laws using AI. What's your response to something like that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a bad idea. Just my instinctually, and that's my quick reaction, okay, to something like that. And it's partly because there are things that happen in life that that are not mechanistic, not technological, right? And they really take a human brain to think it through and exercise uh, wisdom, intellect, um, emotion, right? Creativity, and by relegating something as important as legislation to generative AI, I think would be a horrible mistake, right? Because even if, for instance, let's say it sounded okay, the problem with things that are rhetorical is that many times you hear an argument, for instance, and you basically are at that point swayed or biased, right, in a direction, and you don't look at all the other directions, okay, that may be ignored, okay, in that rhetorical argument or rhetorical statement. I've made arguments to juries, okay, where that's precisely what I want to happen. but but if I'm actually crafting legislation or policy, that's a whole different, ball of wax, right? And consequently, you need basically to have something that basically is just a whiteboard, and then there's people who are putting their ideas down so that they could be explored on a wider level. And I don't think Gen AI, frankly, does that very well. I don't think so. I haven't actually raised an interesting point as to what are all the other issues that now we might want to explore that we haven't, because you've given me already the melody. You've given me the melody in my words, and it sounds great, and I'm going to go with it. Okay. But there may well be other options, okay, and other ways of coming at this.
Very interesting. I do remember back in 2015, 16 being asked by a journalist to research an area of an occasion where somebody was evading traffic fines by getting a deep learning model to create letters
Mhm.
to the administration to find loopholes in their legislation of how to evade a traffic fine. And so these have been occurring pre-generative AI. I do
Yeah,
think, you're
yeah,
going to have to, we're going to start seeing this, if we do
sure.
build these laws using AI. We will see AI facing off against the AI, and it could be a human-operated AI, of course, to evade a fine or find a loophole in the legislation. But it's very interesting what is going on. And I do like the beginning of your essay, Joe. You're right. If quantum mechanics, computers, and genetic engineering were the paradigm shifts that define the 20th century, AI will undoubtedly define the 21st. And in this article, which was an award-winning article, which really is fantastic for IEEE TTS as well, we've argued long and well that qualitative research uh, can actually be award-winning. Mixed methods can also be award-winning, but I urge everyone to read the article. You cover things like technology around the GPTs and large language models and generative AI and how they work based on billions of parameters. Um, Performance and whether more parameters equal better performance or not, the innate limits that prevent absolute assurances in the use of generative AI, and what does that mean when we talk about accuracy, the importance of responsible innovation, legal issues that you anticipate to surface in a world of generative AI, and among them you talk about privacy and data protection, copyright infringement, bias and fairness, safety and reliability, product liability, and then, of course, even as we saw the EU AI Act come into play, you talked about governmental regulation. And we've seen the US try to remove the guardrails with the beautiful act. Um, any thoughts on any aspect of the paper that stick out to you as being of primary importance today?
That's a good question. Um, because now you're asking me to go back and inspect my brood and pick out one of the children that I'd like to hear better, like to hear more from. Um, Probably it may well be in the conclusion. I haven't read it conclusion lately, um, but it gets back, I think, again to my earlier point. And in fact, I made the point very early in the essay or in the paper, and that this is something like a trolley problem in ethics. Okay, where you have a switch, all right, that someone could turn the switch on an ascending or descending locomotive, all right, and whether it goes in track A or track B. And unfortunately, the person manning the switch doesn't have any good options. Do I kill more people in track A, or do I kill Einstein in track B, for instance? All right, or whatever the metaphor you want to use is. But I think it's the recognition that we are faced with this switch, and I don't believe that it's an A or B, right, choice that we need to make here. That things will go down track A and things will go down track B. And as we've discussed before, um, you can think about this thing as sort of kind of a Cartesian coordinate, and basically two curves going in this direction. And this curve over here represents things that are going in the bad direction, and these things are going in a good direction. And so that ultimately what we need to do is we need to continue to work and discuss and to think through at what point, okay, does this curve go to the point, okay, where we need to now cut it off and not permit anything to go beyond that, or at least not go beyond that without some serious contemplation and scrutinization, either legal or moral or whatever. Okay. And in the good direction, again, we have things that are going to be going in the good direction, but things can sometimes become so good that they actually flip over, okay, and are not good anymore. Right? So this idea that I have about creating music in my music room may not be so good for, I don't know, the music industry as such. Okay, when artists who devote and spend their entire lives putting their heart and soul and their lives into their product or into their music or into their literature, call it what you may. When we reach a point, if we were to reach a point, okay, when these people would be discouraged from going on, and we actually end up in a world, okay, which is vacant, okay, of the creative soul, essentially, because it's all been relegated, okay, to Gen AI. So I think I do talk a little bit about that in the paper, in the very beginning, that we are dealing with this dichotomy between good and bad. What's new in technology? All
Mm.
technology is good and bad. A hammer is good and bad, and so is an axe. Right? So, and maybe even things that as as controversial as my next statement, maybe even the atomic bomb has good and bad. Maybe just being there keeps the bad people away. I don't know. I'm not wise enough to fully appreciate that, but I do think that the boundaries by which we allow our mind to explore these things should be open, should be wide open, and we should continue to, again, use what we have. And this isn't scientific; it's just the passion that we come to understand a project, and then we apply, our intellect, our logic, critical thinking, okay, in order to get to the answer. So this is like a lot of other things that happen in our lifetimes. The difference here is that it's come upon us so quickly. It's like an avalanche, okay, and so we're all scrambling to come up with the right ideas and words and ways in which we explain how it is that we're going to uh, uh, take stock of what's in front of us, and what we should be concerned about. It's really hit us pretty hard. Other things like the automobile took a century before we realized that it was going to bring the planet down. It took us a long time. Could we have come up? Could we have thought about this thing sooner? Well, I don't know, but there are things that are happening not only in general Gen AI, but probably in other quarters that, for instance, genetic engineering. I mean, we could go on and on and on, that are equally, not equally important, but they are as important, okay, as our conversations about Gen AI in terms of what they mean, right? In terms of for humanity, what we may end up looking like 150 or 200 years from now. So this isn't really a singular problem, but it's within a spectrum of problems. But this one here hit us quite hard and quite fast.
I think you're alluding a lot to AI literacy, AI fluency, uh, and
Yes.
raising awareness and education. What we're seeing at the moment, at least what I'm being told from some corporates, is that they are milking the fact that they are ahead of the majority of the population if they have invested in training for their staff. I'll give you an example. A 3-month endeavor that would be billed for 3 months of labor is still being billed for 3 months of labor, even though generative AI is being used and very fewer resources are being used, as in terms of human resources. So there is this gap. We used to talk about the digital divide, those who have internet access and those who do not, or those that have a telephone and those that do not. And this is something quite different. There are grades of differentiation between people from different sectors and different experiences. But I do encourage people who are listening not to fear generative AI, but rather to gain as much exposure, whether it is to do with a pastime such as making music or images and drawing and photography. Unless you perhaps don't actually understand the finer nuances of the issues that are being raised in all different kinds of sectors, and it's all very much context specific. I think about copyright infringement and the fallaciousness of the current system that sort of sends notices to people who have possibly used an image that is copyrighted, and yet anyone who's using generative AI through DALL-E 2 or any other image generator relying on generative AI gets off scot-free. And personally accept that on the one hand, you can find someone who has used a nice stock image, but you can't find anyone who's used the DALL-E 2 image. And now we're seeing this movement, of course, to evade, licensing and other things and potential infringement from not using these images and going to generative AI. I mean, what do you make of that kind of scenario?
Well, yeah, you're saying that by using the Gen AI images, they don't have to basically pay royalties anymore. And that's what I was driving at a few minutes ago. That I do think that that's when this part of the curve goes to the point when we really we have to be careful. And in this beautiful legislation, okay, that the Trump administration is touting, where it may prevent states from passing laws having to do with such things as that, for instance.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, copyright law is a matter in the United States anyway, a federal law, so the states wouldn't even be involved anyway. But I think it's a grave mistake to not think that even for all of the good that can happen, there are things that we need to be mindful of because it has consequences in the extreme. Many years ago, I worked on a project which was trying to divide up uh, or trying to do what we call a white blood cell differential count. There are 5 white blood cells in our bloodstream or of any consequence. And what we were doing was to basically read the images off of a microscope slide, as the pathologists were doing in that era. And then what we were trying to do is to ascertain what the differences were between one cell and another based on their morphology. All right. And it took us about 5 years, but ultimately we were able to sort of demonstrate that this machine learning type of artificial intelligence could work, all right, and basically reduce pathology time and effort and improve accuracy. So all that is good, right? Because it's
Hmm.
basically, even if it was displacing some of the workforce who was prior to that doing it, but only had a 70% accuracy rate, all right? Because that's the human limit, okay, as it turned out, okay? With the machine, you could basically be up around the 90s, okay, so to speak.
Yes.
So we decided to get a little bit, to go off sort of um, in another direction. And we were beginning to look at Papa Nicolau
Mm.
smears. Right?
Yes.
And we actually came to invite someone who had been at St. George, I think, Hospital in London, who was one of the world's renowned Papa Nicolau smear, or at least cancer specialists. So he came to our laboratory, and we were basically trying to demonstrate, how we could separate cancerous smears, okay, from non-cancerous ones. And we were having a devil of a time. And we were asking him, give us a hint as to how it is morphologically that you see this change. And he would look down the microscope and say, it's very difficult for me to explain. I know what I'm looking at. He said, but I can't, it's hard for me to basically translate that into a language that you can understand. And I came away after that experience, which, went on for several weeks, that there are some things that machines aren't capable to do, and we're not explaining, we don't know why, right?
Mm.
But that the human brain, okay, is much more intelligent, I guess, much more aware, okay, of how it decides and how it determines things than a machine ever could, right? And this was one of those instances. And the reason I refer back to it is because this is one of those things that we can sort of we see as well, that's impossible. You're dealing in science, all right, aren't you? Yeah, we're dealing in science and mathematics and all of that. But at the end of the day, even in that sphere, even in that realm, there's things that humans, okay, are much better able to do than our AI. If I translate that by analogy, okay, to our struggling artist, all right, the same thing is true. Okay, so the AI may create, great art and whatnot, but it doesn't create it as a human creates great art with all its imperfections, okay, with the things that are indescribable, and that it is those very imperfections that define the creator, the person, okay, who's actually putting ink on paper. All right. And, so I think that, we have to think more about this thing. I don't say philosophically. I think this is philosophical as well as a reality that we have sometimes failed to recognize.
I had heard a talk from someone who was studying digitally remastered vinyl records and talking about the sound on a vinyl record versus that which had been digitally remastered, and how most people would prefer the the vinyl record with its imperfections because it was more real. I probably haven't summated.
No,
Uh,
you've summated it well. When I was
yes.
back in the day, when I was in my electrical engineering days, I actually built several amplifiers, 100-watt amplifiers with tubes because transistors had not yet been developed
Mm,
for power. All right. And I had those, there was these big tubes and transformers and the like. And I had a turntable that had vinyl, okay, and had a sapphire stylus that you'd put on the groove, and I'd listen to that, right? There was nothing in my estimation that would ever compare to the sound that I obtained using that technology. Now, how can I describe that? I can't.
mm,
And I was an engineer, but engineers have never been able to sort of define that, okay,
mm.
analytically, as to why the tube and the transformer and the sapphire on the record groove works better than the transistor.
Yes, and your comments about pathology are really pertinent to me. I've had the pleasure of teaching many MBA pathology students, or
Mm-hmm.
those that work in pathology labs. And I even had the great fortune of meeting a British pathologist recently, maybe 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about how AI is changing things in some places. There is a huge shortage in pathologists. So that's the first issue that we've come up against. Greater demands, and AI is being used in a very systematic way to capture diagnoses, why pathologists have said X or Y in their determinations, and all that data being captured over many years now, not just, in the generative AI times. People could see that this was coming, but that pathologists could be remote, for example, rather than ever taking a holiday, perhaps taking a holiday and still working part-time just to fulfill those demands, depending on context. But that the human was to be augmented by the machine, not in a negative way, but in a way that would increase accuracy and also uh, tap into that knowledge base of previous pathologists who had been trained and were in that space. But I think we've hit a really important point in our discussion today. And you ask, what is that element? And we spoke briefly before this recording about the importance of embodiment. You called it wisdom, perhaps on this recording. And let's talk about discernment. A firefighter discerns when it's too dangerous to go into a home that's emblazoned versus sending in a drone, or the pathologist discerns, as in the case of the pap smear test that you were referring to, whether this is cancerous or not. And I keep thinking back to the bigger picture and the context. And I think GPT or LLMs or generative AI, they have a difficulty in the embodied context, in the actual notion that there is a world. They could probably rattle off 50 definitions, but they're not, it's not actually
In
encapsulated
the
in a
world.
body. It's soulless, if I wanted to say, for those who do believe in a divinity of some type, the machine is soulless, but it also doesn't have embodiment. And even if it was in a robot, it's still lacking something. And what is that something, Joe, to you? What is it lacking?
Well, it's lacking, as I said before, or I've said this not before, I've said it in other things I've written about and spoken to. Uh, Humans have an essence, all right, and we can't ignore that. Otherwise, we can just disappear and let the machines take over. Right? We're here for a purpose. We're here for a reason. And every living thing has an essence. I
Mm,
am here, in beautiful New Mexico for the summer, and I look outside and I see the birds, for instance, or I see the deer that come by every afternoon, a whole herd of them. Each thing has its essence. That deer can't be replaced by Gen AI or anything else, and neither can that bird. And neither can my experience, okay, hearing that bird or looking at that deer, all right? Because it fulfills within my essence something that it feeds, it's feeding it, right? And what is it? It's either logos, pathos, or ethos. Okay, so pathos is the emotion. Okay, that basically keeps me alive. A machine kit doesn't do that. Now maybe there might be a robot someday that just understands that, gives me great things to think about, and maybe make believe deer. All right, but it ain't going to give me the real deer. Right, it's not going to give me the real experience. So it doesn't fill up the pathos. Okay, that's within me, or the logos, okay, which again is my intellect, the thing that the doctor from St. George's Hospital had, okay, that couldn't be conveyed and be somehow concretized inside of a machine. All right, so we have the logos piece of it, okay, and then there's the ethos part. The ethos part is the moral part. All right, the machine can't tell what's moral or immoral. We could try to teach it that, but there's subtleties. If you've practiced, well, all of us practice our ethic every day. So it's not as if one profession is better at it than another. But I've come at it from the legal profession. And one time I was a special public defender for a number of years. I had a practice, but I would defend people in court, mostly young minorities in America, uh, against charges, some of which, they participated in and got themselves in hot water, and other times not so. All right. So there's a moral quality to that a machine couldn't basically face. And then frankly, I faced prosecutors who were like machines. All right.
hmm
But it was that I was able, okay, in order to persuade them to go lenient or persuade a judge in some respects, whether I had tears in my eyes or whatever it took, right? fall before the altar, okay, in order to make something good happen out of what was a bad beginning. Machines can't do that.
In terms of the fact that they can't do that, when we're talking about unsafe systems or unreliable systems, those systems that are unfairly biased in some way, whether it's against minorities to pay greater tariffs because they're perhaps going to uh, a particular neighborhood, or a gender question with regards to women seeking a loan from a bank, and automatically we are served in some kind of contextual bias. Uh, when do these systems become unsafe, and when do they become unjust?
I think when we, again, substitute our judgment for machine's judgment, they look at resumes, for instance, right? And they decide, they look at 1,000 resumes and then decide these 5 resumes are worthy of personal interviews. Right? I think that's a mistake. All right. I think, well, don't look at 1,000 resumes, look at 100, look at 20, but at least do it, okay, from a set of human eyes and ears and experience. And so I think that, this is, again, probably not the best use. Certainly it's not the best use for machines. And all of those things, okay, which are similar, like applying for credit, or you're applying to school, or you're applying for a job, okay, or whatever the case may be. The machine inherently is going to be biased. We know that, right? Because it's scraping humans' behavior out there, okay? And in particular societies, I live in one, I live in the United States. We have great divisions, but they're enormous. We have millions of people who basically think in a particular way that frankly don't think the way I think. So they're going to be if they're the ones that they're scraping information from, then that's not, in my estimation, a good thing. I would rather basically test my odds of succeeding in some respect or another by arguing my case to a human than arguing my case to an AI judge. And they're obviously talking about judgments, okay, which will be, monitored or at least done by AI, Gen AI in the future. I mean, this is a sort of science fiction right now, but I don't know if it's so science fiction because you can imagine it happening, as you mentioned before, where you can look through cases and say, okay, for this set of facts, this kind of evidence, then it means this, but it may not, and that's, again, I come at this from a lawyer point of view in this case, where, juries have been around since, I don't know, 1250. And maybe before that, I'm sure the Greeks had jurors back in the 500s, minus 500s, BCE. So I don't think that this is a novel thing, right? To have jurors, okay, and have the actual people decide on guilt or innocence or right or wrong. I don't say it's perfect, and it's far from perfect. Right? I used to teach a course in trial practice and tried my own cases, and I, you know, they were not it was a tough time in my life because I saw a lot of injustice. But frankly, I would prefer the law, okay, over the machine any time, and I think that was a sentiment that was stated in A Man for All Seasons. I didn't quite say it as elegantly as Shakespeare or whomever it was that wrote A Man for All Seasons, but essentially that's what it was. Right? I'll take the law.
Interesting example of A Man for All Seasons. Incidentally, I played King Henry in that one in grade 11, but we won't go there. 7,000 uh, applicants in Australia are sometimes screened. On their resumes, they're cut down to about 700 to be video interviewed through observation via Zoom online or MS Teams, and then other generative AI is being used to record, of course, biometrics and look at human behavior in response to being observed, and a lot of personal details collected by organizations to actually select candidates that were never met in the flesh, which I find that fascinating. So there are many organizations investing wholly in online practices, almost refusing to see candidates even if they prefer to meet in person. And that kind of volume of screening must have inaccuracies. I'm sure they've made some good judgments, but how fair is it to be based on an observation where you're under surveillance in effect? And that leads to questions on privacy that you also identify in your article and the need for data protection. And the question I have is, what are the limits of privacy, when individuals may be subject to hallucinations if people are doing reconnaissance checks on them via GPT, wrong data being generated on AI, and people using, taking this and seeing some kind of elemental response. What do you make of privacy in the context of generative AI?
Well, again, the thing with generative AI is that it has created a pathway for almost everyone, okay, to get on that path and to use it in all kinds of ways, not the least of which could be nefarious. If we were dealing with one person having to program a computer before they actually got to a stage, that's one thing. But we've now reached a point where the system, Gen AI, okay, is accessible to just about anybody, okay, from, I don't know, pick an age, 7, 8 years old up to 90 or 100, whatever. And so consequently, there's there are probably ways. I can imagine we could sit here and we could speculate, but I think it wouldn't be far-fetched to say that there are malefactors out there, okay, who are right now figuring out ways in which they could substitute or at least chip away at your identity, right? Because somehow privacy's been breached, right? And begin to obviously use it in ways in which are going to compromise an individual in any number of ways, right? Not the least of which is economic. Um, so I think that it basically has provided us, or all of us, the population at large, an instrument that is sometimes more powerful than the person who's actually using it. Okay, should really have in their possession. You know, it's I don't want to say it's as powerful as a loaded gun that can kill, because that might be an overstatement in terms of a comparison or an analogy. Um, but it is powerful, and it can hurt people because people can, basically invade one's privacy and then use that, okay, in ways that they could manufacture through prompts, within generative AI. And now there are, countervailing technologies um, that that we can begin to think of, like blockchain, for example.
Hmm.
Okay, but they're cumbersome. And does everybody really want to basically live in a world of blockchain? I don't, and I'm a lawyer. All right, but I more frequently get blockchain contracts.
Yes.
Where we sign them. So there are countervailing technologies, and maybe they'll get simpler, and maybe more people can be using them so that they can verify things like their identity. Because I think the identity theft is a real serious one. Right?
Yes. I think so too. I think it is a cybersecurity risk, and uh, I guess GPTs, in terms of the ones that we're very familiar with today, are only as good as the open source intelligence on the internet, and that only to a particular date, depending on when they're searching. Um,
Right.
and the question then becomes, if we start relying on these engines, and there are large-scale disinformation campaigns that are of a quantum level, you can actually create a lot of noise in the system and create greater inaccuracies simply by flooding the internet with deep fakes, disinformation, misinformation, whatever else you want that is fake. And this difficulty in detecting what's real, what's not, in terms of what we're seeing today and calling hallucinations, but in actual fact, maybe more than just hallucinations. Um, so wherever there's a good thing, you can bet your bottom dollar. Cybersecurity hackers are trying to penetrate systems and dismantle them just for the fun of it, beyond causing some,
Mhm.
mass scale disruption. And then also the democratization of these generative AI systems, as many have alluded to. I'm on the steering committee of the NDIF, which is supposed to be a democratic, accessible GPT, not one that is driven by private concerns and private stakeholders and shareholders for that matter. And the question then becomes, while we haven't seen it as yet, perhaps as something that's visible, is how long will it take before something that drives search engines also drives GPTs, whether that's advertising, marketing approaches, or some kind of pay model that says, you'll come up on the definition of X or Y, or the accessibility of X or Y with links and so forth. I mean, it's only a matter of time before these become visible in these open systems. I don't really think anything is free. I don't know if you have a perspective on what's coming next with these generative AI systems.
Well, you must have been reading my mind because one of the assumptions we're making, well, maybe not you and I, but many are making, is that we're living sort of in a static environment, static world. This is Gen AI, and this is the way Gen AI is going to be 5 years, 10 years, 100 years from now. Right? But the fact is that it's not just Gen AI that is the concern. Gen AI in and of itself will evolve. It'll become more sophisticated as time goes by. It'll be launched from, or it'll be on other types of machinery, other types of computers. Um, Quantum computers, for example, could be in the next, 10, 15 years, where it's much faster, much smarter, much more robust. Right. So when you think about invention, in my experience, again, I can go back at a time when there was a time when I was working on what was called the Lunar Orbiter Program. And the Lunar Orbiter Program was a program that was going to circumvent the moon and take pictures of the surface so that the Apollo missions could land on the moon. And so my participation amongst a bunch of other engineers was to build a scanner that could track the rate at which the lunar orbiter was circumventing the moon, and use that rate information as feedback to a system of to a photographic system, so that the lens could move at the same rate, and essentially you wouldn't get any blur, okay, in the picture. Right, to make a long story short. So it was a very efficient system, very accurate. About 10 years later, actually about 15 years later, the inventor came to me, who I've known now for 20 years, Emil Bolzi, very well known inventor, okay, from Switzerland, of the Bolex camera fame of the 1930s and 40s, his father, anyway. Saying, Joe, now I was a patent lawyer. I was no longer an engineer. He said, remember what we worked on? Yeah, I remember that. He says, I think it's been stolen because the patents were finally let to issue by the government because they were under secrecy for many years. And they're now being used in the cruise missile for guidance. Okay. So here we have this thing, okay, which was this tracker to go around the moon for what was, the best reasons possible, I guess, if you're a nerd, okay, wanting to see what the moon was all about. And in the final analysis, it was used for purposes of killing people, which was not his intention, okay? It was not designed to do that. So Gen AI is a great thing. It's a great invention, but, we don't stand still. We move into the future, and things are perverted. Things are put to other applications, maybe in the very form we're now thinking about it in terms of putting in a prompt. But it may not be that for all applications you simply put in a prompt. There may be other things, okay, that are put in that are prompt-like. For example, right now, as I understand, well, in fact, certainly understand with music, you don't necessarily need language, okay, in order to prompt, okay, a Gen AI. Any sequence of data, signals, let's call it what it is in electronics, signaling can go into that, and it could begin to differentiate signals. Right? So there's any number of other things, okay, that it can be used as for inputs and outputs, to make a long story short. So I think in the future, just thinking about how invention goes and how people are both curious and innovative, this thing isn't standing still. We're looking at it as a point in time. This is a snapshot, and everything we've talked about today is a snapshot. Right now, just what's it going to look like 3, 5, 10 years from now?
I think you're right. MG Micro and I have just finished an editorial that we hope will come out in September on axis of access. We've recently added in a section on at least what is known in the current news with uh, agreements and joint activities between OpenAI's Sam Altman and Joni Ive, the product developer at Apple for 30 years, who's responsible for the iMac and so much more, and his company Love From. And at least through leaks, what is known to date is that they're working on a device that won't have an interface, like a visual interface that we prompted, rather everything's spoken. It's a pendant that sits around your neck or is desk-based, but is small and has all sensors embedded just like a mobile phone and hears everything and responds to everything and doesn't require typing. You can still prompt using a voice, but more so it's about human activity monitoring and behavior, and will do away with anything that requires you to look into something and rather is something that you wear and is ambient and aware. I mean, it kind of sounds like Ubervalence to us from what we read, but it'll be very much using uh, everyday speak. So every word you utter in its presence will be captured and fed into this giant machine, but also every prompt you speak will be recorded and a response given to you. And if you want it in a written form, it can be sent to you in that way. So more like your unified messaging systems where we had, facsimile to text in an SMS or facsimile to an email or a Word document. Now it'll be basically speech to speech, speech to text, speech to anything. Um, and then we start thinking about agentic systems. So we're not really talking to another human, we're talking to a machine to another, and that machine is more agentic AI. So it's machine to human potentially, where all these transformations are happening in an automatic way, um, based on rules, potentially, and perhaps not on rules. As we know, generative AI is not rules based like the traditional AI. But then where will this go? And this has really huge implications as far as I'm concerned. I know that most of the words I speak are not worth much during the day, and I wouldn't want those recorded, and I wouldn't want those stored online. And really, I start to think about the environmental externalities at that point. But you're right, Joe. What we think generative AI is for is certainly not where we're going to end up. But I'll probably allow you to comment on that kind of scenario. What do you think about
Well,
that?
if you remember 10 years ago, I think, about 10 years ago, you and I were at a conference in Toronto,
Hmm.
if you remember.
I
And
do.
one of our main, I think he was a speaker, but certainly was a fellow from MIT that had the camera on his head. Remember, I've forgotten his name now.
Professor Steve Mann, yes.
Yeah, yeah, Steve, exactly. So, that was the technology then, all right? And, it basically went into a recorder period. And so you could see how the advance has how advance has been made. An advance has been made to take that camera that was basically
Hmm.
on all the time for him, 24 hours a day, and will now basically be used in some sense, right, through this agent. So I think that we have to think more broadly, all right, and we can't leave there's so much to talk about, so much to think about. We've been talking about, again, the frame as we see it now. How do we talk about the frame as it unfolds? And I don't know if there's enough conversation about that, right? I mean, there may be, in places like maybe MIT or maybe up in Google and the like, when they're thinking about what's going to roll out. Okay, but for folks like ourselves, even who are pretty well plugged in to this stuff, we don't get to participate in those conversations, and maybe never will. So maybe we have to be a little bit more speculative, or maybe a little bit more, you know, uh, maybe not always right about what the future may hold, but at least get it out there on the table so that people can begin to think about the variations and the permutations, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you actually stipulate that in your award-winning article because you talk about responsible innovation. You also talk about the need for socio-technical intervention research, alluding to the
Right.
work of Eric Fisher at Arizona State
Yeah.
Uni and many others. But I think you're right. We need to develop instruments as other stakeholders and feed into the stakeholder development process somehow. There needs to be some kind of public response that is recorded and noted and fed back. I mean, you've always talked about feedback loops. And I don't know
Yeah.
if you want to say anything in particular. You do mention this in the article, but why feedback loops? Why are they important in innovation?
Well, because again, the feedback loop always there's a if it's the right kind of feedback, it's a moderator, right? It stabilizes things, right? That's what feedback typically does. But sometimes feedback can also be regenerative feedback. Often that's not a good thing because it destabilizes the system. When you have too many people, like so, let's say too many tech people working without the benefit of some conscience on their shoulder, right, or some other, you know, moderating force, um, things can get out of go out of bounds, I suppose. Um, you know, back in the late 30s, early 40s, Einstein tried to be the feedback mechanism for Roosevelt in terms of whether the bomb should be developed or not. Right? But there was too much regenerative feedback happening at the time, right? And they won out in final analysis. So I do think that this idea, when I talked about it in my paper, I was thinking more along the lines that there's an internal feedback happening within Gen AI products
Mm,
themselves, all right, that needs to be fully understood and appreciated. And again, making sure that it doesn't become regenerative. So, for instance, fortifying a bias, okay, strengthening a bias, or strengthening a prejudice, strengthening some bad feature, okay, that the generative AI has, um, because it's learning bad behavior from itself. You know, a lot of the AI generators they claim, okay, don't use things that are basically that they're producing output for. All right, but I don't take that at face value either, because that's, you know, maybe Chat GPT or maybe Microsoft speaking or maybe Google speaking, but everybody may not be speaking that way, right? And there may well be those that want, right, to have to strengthen a particular point of view or things, okay, that and again, this gets to another element that we haven't talked too much about, but a lot of the generative AI products are being integrated into particular applications, like for professions, like for lawyers, for doctors, for academics, for writers, on and on, musicians, on and on and on. They're closed systems, and those closed systems may well, you know, take and contain and scrape whatever it is that is being put into the system. And so if they're being subjected to input, okay, which is one-sided, then they become one-sided systems at the end, because they're basically being trained essentially uh, in a particular way. And I don't doubt that that isn't something that somebody's going to do it if they're not already doing it, right? Because there may well be, and I can't imagine. I guess I could explore. You know, we could have a brain, you know, sort of think about, you know, all the various ways in which someone might want a system like that. But I can imagine, for instance, a totalitarian system would want that. All right. So if you're working in a totalitarian system or authoritative system or a fascist system, and they had themselves, okay, some generative AI product, they would want to reinforce their bad, you know, philosophies, political philosophies, for instance.
yes.
You know, in some ways, you know, you know, we do that as humans, right? I mean, we form institutions, and sometimes those institutions basically are there because they represent a particular kind of thought process, thinking
Hmm.
process. So why don't we, or why shouldn't we expect that someone's going to want to put one of those things into a Gen AI product for a particular reason, for right-wing politics or left-wing politics or whatever the case may be?
Yes, this was some of the concern when China launched its DeepSeek GPT,
Right.
and whether it would be bound
Yeah.
by communist ideals, and if certain searching would actually bring up objective responses. We could also point to systems like TikTok, which gathers data now from inside homes when people press the record and upload from different contexts that are private spaces, perhaps.
Sure.
Uh, and even
Right.
Wikipedia, if we really wanted to be sinister and think about who are the administrators behind Wikipedia, despite that it looks quite democratic, what are we reading? Where has it come from? Who has authorized it? These are highly
Right.
important. And I take your point. I heard a YouTube commercial. I think it was the company was called Eureka IO, which was supposed to help professors generate their curriculum in, half an hour as opposed to weeks and weeks and weeks of work in preparation. I'm always concerned when these things are auto-generated, particularly from the notion of diversity of thought and us becoming a sort of a monoculture. I think that the minute we're all using the same system to generate the same answers to the same questions, we're not being diverse, and we're actually not being open-minded. Donella Meadows' alternate habits of mind comes to mind, and we're not practicing that which we should, even as individuals, let alone as educators. So I am keeping an
Mhm.
eye out on how AI is being used in education, or for learning, and I'm concerned uh, by a number of different rhetorics going back to very um, early t teaching machines that were there to encourage almost rote learning to an extent and ticking off whether certain things had been
Sure.
um, attained,
Sure.
although we need those systems in terms of compliance. I think we need to focus more on developing individuals who can think independently. And I think that's where you're going. Interestingly, and I think we could talk so much more about the article, and I encourage everybody to read it. They can find it on the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society website if they have IEEE access. They can also find it on your personal website, cavalco.com, and that is there under the essays tab. But I'm interested in hearing a bit about your new book, if we have time for that. It's called
Sure.
Circuitry and Sentience: Why Machines Can't Dream. And you state, knowing what I know about AI, I felt an urge to celebrate what sets us apart from machines, which is another word for AI these days. I try to shed light on what it means to be human, to honor our autonomy, to create as a human. In many ways, this is an age-old tension as between the guardians of human creativity and pragmatic technocrats. Tell us why you wrote this and tell us more about it.
Well, it's a way of trying to humanize um, um, the situation we find ourselves. And we have a tendency to talk more about the technology,
Hmm.
ChatGPT, what it's doing, and this really focuses more on why is it that humans will always have the necessity to exercise that essential piece of themselves, which is creativity. Right? And in order to do that, you need to be grounded in real experience in the world. And so this is a book more about the world and experience and human experience, and coming back to the question repeatedly, and how can generative AI, basically report out this experience. And so that's the theme essentially. That's the idea, the objective, right, of what I was trying to do here. Um, and it's deceptive, right? Because sometimes that, if you were to use it to create a poem, for instance, or lyrics, they seem pretty good, even to someone who, like yourself or myself, likes to
Hmm.
dabble in, fiction or poetry and the like. Um, and that's okay if it wants to compete against me, but it doesn't certainly satisfy my own uh, desire, right, to express myself, right. So in some ways, maybe it is like, listening to a bad recording, right? Um, but I think that we should be looking at it from the other angle, the other 180-degree angle, the mirror image, right? That it's ours to create. It's not it to create. Right? It could facilitate, but never create, because, as I said before, it doesn't see the bird out on the fence, and it doesn't see deer marching through my lawn every afternoon at 5 o'clock. Right? Only I see that. Right? And I can't imagine how Gen AI could appreciate the emotion, okay, that it sets up, okay, in me and the sense of my being in the world. So I'm not I'm not discouraged, that somehow it's going to learn to play the piano like I play it. Certainly, it probably will play it better, but it will never play it with as much emotion as it relates to myself, right? As I as I could bring to bear, okay, on the instrument. Anyway, that's what the book is about.
Well, it's a much needed book of our time. You have written, I would say, almost a dozen books now, if not more. You've produced so much music. By yourself. I encourage people to listen to the piano and to read your essays on a variety of topics and also poetry. I know one of your books made a summer reading list last year, and really your notion about the birds always reminds me of a wise old man who once said, this is why we don't have one eye, we've got two eyes. We're binocular, not ocular, and we see through both for a reason. That's why we don't have one eye. Um, you write in the book, humans root themselves in emotions, intuitions, and ultimately and interpretation of all that combines in our complex worlds today. So it's all of this. But I reject, you say, the idea that as human innovators, all we are destined to fade into obsolescence because technology asserts itself into our lives. That said, we must be mindful that even though AI may not enjoy the human perspective, it may well displace the human, as it may be commercially more economical for those who employ the artist, the writer, musician, inventor, or doctor, lawyer, and judge. But you say if we fail in keeping this force under control, and it comes to plan, organize, direct, and control our actions, it will be due to our complacency, neglecting to restrain the social and economic forces presently working to bring about commercial objectives, political change, changes in our ideas about a just world. And I must say, this next bit is one of my favorite. We must not forget that it is we who are the creators. Just what you just said, Joe. The intellects and humanitarians in the world, and should not relinquish our position to the mechanics of the modern algorithm. In the unseen threads of our DNA, we carry life's unbroken sequence as it masterfully winds its way on a 3.5 billion year voyage into the future. It's been an arduous journey for the mothers of our mother and fathers of our father as they struggled to harvest traits now bequeathed to each of us, a specialized physicality, intellect, emotion, skills, and creativity to live in a particular world. These are the ubiquitous, malleable essentials that characterize every human on their own trek through time, shifting and shaping according to their aspirations, adversities, and perseverance. And we can never replace this fact about ourselves, what we have acquired on our travels through life. In plain English, AI lacks empathy, moral reasoning, and the ability to consider unique circumstances that a human judge would. Among our traits, creativity stands out along this epic journey as it powers our life force, without which we could not strive as a species. It emerges out of our inventions, our performances, our poems, arts, and music, the kinds of practices that we lawyers spend a lifetime endeavoring to improve our intellect, our skill, our sensitivities, defining our humanity. AI puts us at the intersection between the humanity and technology, as in our humanity and technology, to commanding forces brought into stark relief by recent developments in AI. At the end of the day, story of us as humans tells the larger, grander story about how these forces define who we are. In the darkest moments, I marvel how resilience among our most talented doesn't waver, how the cleverness of scientists solve problems that threaten entire populations, or artists paint the devastation of loss so the world never forgets. I've come to understand that progress requires courage, as it is about persistence in the face of fear and adversity. We see that our greatest achievements come not in spite of the storms we weather, but because of them. I think to end off our call, given the current geopolitical situation, uh, that is a wonderful moment to end it off. And it's hope that you describe. I think it's the spontaneity in humans and the striving and the effort that makes us different. Um, we wouldn't be human otherwise. If someone plugged something into our brain that enabled us to think in a generative AI capacity, we'd just be a machine, and then what's the point? But I marvel at your pen, Joe Cavalco. I congratulate you again, and wonder if there's anything else you wanted to say to close off this interview.
No, I think what we could just leave it there, Katina. And I want to thank you so much for being a champion, right? My champion, certainly, and a champion for folks like myself, okay, who need someone such as you to basically call attention to, you know, the hard work of a lot of people, including yourself. Um, so we'll leave it there. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. I'm cognizant, having listened to many wise scholars, that sometimes those who are not recognized that should be recognized, sometimes that comes late in life. I think you're a discovery to IEEE Society on the social implications of technology, and we've been very blessed to have your volunteerism for so long. I think Yale is the same. That's why they've got you as the chair of that eclectic group on technology and ethics. In the interdisciplinary center they've run for many decades, but sometimes recognition comes late, and I'm so happy that a global institution in AI ethics has recognized your essay, among which I think there will be many more discoveries as people dive into your work and recognize this in time to come. Please keep writing. We already soliciting more work from you for IEEE TTS, hopefully in the not too distant future. But thank you for your time and your wisdom.
Thank you.